We are living in stressful and uncertain times. Staying at home may be necessary for our overall physical health, but it can take a significant personal toll. In fact, a British medical journal, The Lancet, recently looked at the literature on the psychological effects of past quarantines and found an increase in anxiety, post traumatic stress symptoms, confusion, and anger, often for weeks after the quarantine was over. But there are some of us whose physical and psychological well being may be more in jeopardy at home. Domestic violence victims. The rise in domestic violence calls to law enforcement agencies has risen 35% in recent weeks, and this is also true in other countries. In fact, the United Nations has called this the shadow pandemic. The victims whose pictures you see on the screen are no longer able to tell their stories because many of them are dead. But today's guest, Joyce Bilyeu, is here to speak for them and to anyone who is still trapped in a domestic violence situation. So, Joyce, first of all, thank you so much for coming on our show and just talking a little bit about your personal story. So, I just want to open it up and just encourage you to tell me what happened.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for having me on here. I love it when people want to hear survivors' stories. I think survivors have a huge voice, and they don't often get to use it. So I currently work as the director of the client services for the Sacramento Regional Family Justice Center here in Sacramento, but I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. So I was married for 10 years. It was actually 9 years and 6 months, but I was with him for a little over 10 years, and we had 2 beautiful kids. And throughout our marriage, it was pretty abusive, physically, in particular emotionally, mentally, psychologically, sexually. I was strangled quite often. I also was abused during my pregnancies. And there was many times that I went to the hospital for medical treatment, but was never assessed for domestic violence back then, or even checked out for being strangled. I tried to leave my relationships many times throughout the 10 years, but every time I tried to leave, he would threaten to kill himself or to threaten to kill me. And it's pretty scary when you feel like you are responsible for the life of someone if you leave them. And I had law enforcement come out several times. I was never assessed for domestic violence or the risk factors, never given any kind of resources from law enforcement or any kind of safety planning. When I finally did get the courage to leave, leaving is the most dangerous time for victims of domestic violence. And the reason why that is because the more control a victim, such as myself at that time, takes in his or her life, the more out of control their partner is liable to become. So, for example, the more information I got, the more power I was getting, the more knowledge, and the more empowered I was becoming. So I was starting to take control, and he didn't like that. And leaving is the most dangerous time for serious injury or even death. So I finally got the courage to leave, and 6 months after I divorced, he broke into my house with an M16 machine gun. He had 20 rounds in this gun, and I was just a young mom with 2 kids. He chased me down the street and fired 3 shots at me, and the third round went through my hair, the top of my head, and it jammed on that third round and knocked me to the ground. He was arrested, but he was never sentenced to any jail time for that crime. And the reason why I was saying earlier it's the most dangerous time, I was in that, it was like 6 months, and during that 6 months he would stalk me and harass me, and I didn't know nothing about domestic violence. And I was like most people, if I got out I'm going to be safe, when in fact it's totally the opposite. It's the sort of the hell just begins when a survivor leaves, because they are at greater risk of getting seriously hurt or killed. Victims of domestic violence, when I say the if you will, the hell just begins, they're trying to connect to resources like I did, and you go from agency to agency to try to get support from your pastor or from counselors or from shelters or from the district attorney or from law enforcement to the healthcare providers. And sometimes this is all done in one day, trying to get these resources while you're still being harassed and abused by your abuser. It can be pretty stressful and tiring. Sometimes you just want to give up. I wound up going to counseling and getting my children and myself into counseling, and then wound up working in this field of domestic violence, and I have been working in it ever since for over 35, almost 39 years now, helping other people, men and women, in particular women, try to be safe and become empowered. The number one question, though, that people ask me on a daily basis, it was asked to me when I was in my relationship, is why don't I just leave? Why am I staying, or why am I going back? And it is such a really a valid question, but that's not what the question should be. The question should be is, how can I help you? How can I get you connected to resources? Let's see what we can do to support you and your children, and how we can help you be safe. And let's see what we can do to hold this person accountable for breaking the law. So it's not just a matter of getting up and leaving. Sometimes it's, and quite often, it's a matter of life and death versus staying or leaving. But nobody ever asks that question. They always ask, why didn't she leave? Why didn't she get out of the situation? And when you ask me that, it re-victimizes me. It makes me feel like I'm somehow responsible for the abuse because I can't avoid it.
I think sometimes it seems, Joyce, like one of the confusing things for a lot of people is that when they're hearing about domestic violence, they're hearing about the middle part of a relationship or the end of a relationship, and they're not able to see the progression of that relationship. Because I would imagine that the first time you met your ex-husband, he wasn't abusive.
Well, I met him at a young age, and he was just a Vietnam veteran, just got back from Vietnam, and he was a Marine. He seemed pretty exciting to me. And I come from a military family. So he was verbally abusive to me at the very beginning, but I didn't consider it, I guess, or recognize it as verbal abuse, because afterwards he would always be really nice. And that's what I kind of focused on, that nice and those hopes and those dreams. And it was just a progression. The mental abuse and the psychological abuse just got worse, and then it crossed over into physical. In fact, just 2 years into my marriage with him, he broke my jaw, broke my ribs. He assaulted me one night from about 8 o'clock at night till about 6 o'clock in the morning, kicking me over and over in my face, breaking my jaw, kicking my ribs, taking a machete to all of my clothes, and telling me that I better not be there when he gets back, or he's going to kill me. I was getting mixed messages or conflicting messages from him, because I was always told from him if I ever left, he would kill me. Now he's telling me if I stay, he's going to kill me. So I didn't know there was something called domestic violence, and that it gets worse over time and often leads into death. So what happened here is I did leave. I took off on foot and went to get medical treatment. And of course, when my parents took me to the hospital, the first thing the healthcare provider said was, what the hell did I do to piss him off? Making me feel like I was at fault. Mm-hmm. After a period of time, I stayed with my parents for maybe a week, and he called crying, apologizing, saying it's never going to happen again. And I never heard him cry, and to me that was like a step in the right direction. He told me we were going to move and we were going to get better off financially. We'll go to counseling. And we made all those steps in the right, doing all of those things. But little did I know I was sort of like in this honeymoon phase of the cycle of abuse. So I don't know any relationship that's on a lifetime honeymoon. Every relationship will have some conflict now and then, but there's a difference between conflict and violence. So what happens is that cycle starts over again. So the tension just started building up again in my relationship, and then we'd have another explosive incident. And each time we'd have an explosive incident, it went from mental to psychological abuse, then crossing over to pushing and shoving, and then eventually weapons involved. And that cycle, for me, became shorter, became more frequent, and more severe, and crossed over into almost homicide.
And you mentioned that your parents took you to the hospital on at least one occasion, and you spent some time with them. What was their perspective during this period of time?
Both my parents were just devastated, and I had 5 brothers at the time too. My mom had a lawyer on the phone, taking pictures of me and wanted me to file for divorce, but I wound up going back to him. And that was just 2 years into the marriage. Little did I know 8 years later, it was going to continue to get worse.
And so, Joyce, what gave you the courage to try to leave that first time? So that was the time when he broke your jaw and your parents, you went to stay with your
Yeah,
parents for a week, and that was the first time that you left. And then he
yeah,
basically said, I'm sorry, this won't happen again. We're going to get back on our feet. We'll go to counseling and all those things.
right. And then I stayed with him, went back with him, and we moved. We moved out of California. We moved up toward the Canadian border up in Washington State. And little did I know that was just part of the isolation, keeping me from anybody or any source of support. We got better jobs. He was just able to buy better alcohol or better drugs. And I don't want anyone to think that drugs and alcohol is the excuse of domestic violence, because domestic violence is about someone maintaining more power and control over another. And I want to say power and control because they can control it. The majority of them don't go to work and abuse the people around them at work, but they come home and they'll do it to their partners. All that other stuff is the excuse, when they say, I'm sorry, and if I wasn't drinking, it'll never happen again, we'll move, and things will get better financially, and things are happening in that direction. That, to me, I just look at that as another nail being hammered on someone's coffin, sort of as a death threat to them. When I finally did get the courage to actually leave, I believe it was one night he had came home and he just tore the whole house apart. And I remember law enforcement coming out. I've never forgotten this. Law enforcement came out and my husband was like passed out and the house was just torn up. And I remember them telling him to sober up, sleep it off, and for me and my two little babies at 3 o'clock in the morning out in the rain, had to go find a safe shelter. And I just thought, this is not right. But I did go to a safe shelter, and it was two mental health professionals, a husband and wife, and they were volunteers for the local domestic violence program, and they opened their home to me and my two babies. And I remember sitting in a rocking chair by the bed that night, embarrassed, humiliated, and thinking, I cannot wait for the sun to come up so I never have to put my children through this. And this is before I got shot at. I thought, I am never going to put my kids through this anymore. I'm going to break the cycle tonight for them. And so I did. I went to a domestic violence program, and I can tell you the advocate there was amazing. And they gave me so much information on domestic violence. They supported me. They validated me. They told me it wasn't my fault. They just didn't support the violence. And I went into group. I went into individual counseling. I was getting so strong to where I finally got the courage to file for divorce. And I can tell you, the day I filed for divorce and my divorce was final, I was coming out of the courthouse, and I can remember him coming out too. And I just knew that was the day I was going to lose my life. But that was the day he said, I'm sorry, have a good life, I love you and the kids. And little did I know, a few months later, he'd be shooting at me. But I got so strong. And I think the one thing that, even after all of these years and all of the work that I've done for women and children, it's really still hard for me to talk about the impact that it had on my children, who are adults now and have their own families and are very healthy and educated on the dynamics of domestic violence, and I thought, I broke it for them. And I'm just so blessed and thankful for that, and that I've had this journey of a career now to be able to work with others to, if you can't do anything for anybody, you can always offer them hope. And when I was at a time in my life where I had no hope, didn't even know what that felt like, when someone offered that to me, it really did change my life. So that one little door that opened was someone telling me that I'm okay and I'm not crazy and it's not my fault. There's resources for you. That made a huge difference to me.
It's so interesting because I think a lot of us might intuitively think, okay, we need to just tell the person what to do, to get to leave, to do this, to do that. And what I'm hearing you say is that really what a lot of victims need is just emotional support,
Mhm.
encouragement, and hope.
Yeah, someone told me what to do all the time, and you just have to do it at your own pace because it's very dangerous. And sometimes when we're so righteous and we're saying, I'm concerned for your safety and for your children's safety, and you need to get out of here, and you don't have developed a safety plan for them when they're at greater risk of getting seriously hurt or killed, we need to rethink that. What can we do for them now? How can we support them now in this moment and make them feel safe and help them feel a little bit empowered in making their own decisions? They know their story better than anyone. They know their situation better than anyone. But they might not know about resources, and they might not know that, hey, maybe, just maybe, this hasn't been my fault. And maybe, just maybe, I'm not alone here.
Joyce, how do most people get to you? A friend? Is it through law enforcement? How do they hear about you?
Yeah, a lot of them come through the court. A lot of them come through law enforcement here in Sacramento, of outreach. It's word of mouth primarily. It's really ironic because July will be 4 years since this Family Justice Center has had their door open, and we haven't even did an open house, and we've seen almost 10,000 clients. And it's the returning number of clients that's really high. It's almost as great as the new individuals that come in. So if we have 3,000 new clients and we have almost 3,000 returning clients, to me, that returning client is the one who's getting the ongoing support, and they're getting it and they're moving on.
Yeah, they're moving through the cycle. They're getting ready to maybe
Yeah.
permanently leave. You mentioned safety planning, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about risk assessment for homicide or for lethality, because even though I completely agree that every person knows their story better than anybody else, I know that you've talked about some common risk factors that you look for in trying to evaluate how much risk is this person in for actually getting killed.
Well, there is a danger assessment that was created by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. She created a 20 questionnaire that assesses for lethality of victims. And there's several questions. I'm trying to find it here. Yeah, Jackie Campbell, she's a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. And she created these 20 questions. And what she and her colleagues found that women were 20 times more likely to be killed by their partner if their partner had threatened to use a weapon on them. So that's one risk factor there, or to hurt them with a weapon, which mine did. And they were nearly 15 times more likely to be killed if their partner had threatened to kill them. And then they were 10 times more likely to be killed if their partner ever tried to strangle them, which mine did. Some of the questions are, have they ever strangled you? Are they unemployed? Have they ever used drugs or alcohol? Do you have a child that is not his? So these were all risk factors.
And are these things, who uses this risk assessment? I mean, is this something that if somebody comes to you, you would actually sit down with this person and say, look, as part of your safety planning, we have to evaluate how at risk you are, or is something law enforcement uses?
I wish law enforcement used it. Some of them do. Maryland, their domestic violence program there created the lethality assessment program, and it's 11 questions based off of those 20 questions that Dr. Campbell had, and they use it when they go out to a domestic violence scene. And what's really cool about it is it has these 11 questions. They implement the questions, and then if the victim answered so many of these questions, then it sort of activates the call the victim advocate and get them connected to resources right away. When you have someone that you can spend more time with, and you don't just say, oh, here's a risk assessment and hold it in front of them on a clipboard and ask the questions. You don't do it that way because that's not very client-centered. We incorporate it into our conversation with the client. Then there's a way to score it. And the higher the score, of course, the more at risk they are for homicide. So we can better create a safety plan for them. Now, out of the 20 questions, there's a shorter version primarily for law enforcement. It's 11 questions, but there's even a shorter version out of that. That's 5 questions, which I really like for first responders. To me, I think the ideal thing that we need in this country is if that 911 call comes in for a domestic violence, that dispatcher asks those 5 major questions. you know, and then they can put it into the CAD or the computer system that goes right to that responding officer. So when that responding officer, before they even get there, have that information. So they can know then, do I need to bring him back up? You know, what am I getting into? Are there weapons involved? Has this person been strangled? Those are a couple of the 5 questions. And I really think it can prevent lives from being killed, in particular law enforcement and, of course, victims of domestic violence.
One of the
And
thi- one of the things that really struck me is just how related domestic violence is to so many other forms of violence. For example, people who kill law enforcement officers and even mass shooters. There's a higher prevalence of domestic violence histories in mass shooters. And this idea that hopefully we as a culture are outgrowing, but this idea that it's a personal problem or it's a relationship problem or it's none of our business or some of the old things that have lingered way too long, there's a practical part of that. You know, even if people don't want to realize that it affects everybody, we all have children, we all have brothers, we all have sisters. Just from a practical standpoint, it is going to impact everybody at some point.
exactly. And I just feel, as someone who is a survivor of domestic violence, I feel if law enforcement, when they came out to my house and they assessed the risk factors of me being possibly murdered here, if they would have done the assessment on me, they would have been able to connect me to a victim advocate sooner than later. And I could have done some safety planning and got educated on the dynamics of domestic violence. You know, in a perfect world, it would be so nice uh, if our judges uses that. California, they have in their bench guide, they have the danger assessment in there. But do judges use it? Not very many that I know of.
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially in family court where it should be used.
Help me understand what a safety plan might look like, because I know that's such an important part of the services that you provide and that victims need. And as you were saying earlier, a safety plan may not mean leaving immediately right then. So kind of take me through like the range of safety planning that you talk about with people who come to see you.
Well, a safety plan is always very fluid, so it's always changing based on the service the client's getting or their needs, etc. So I'll give you some examples. If a person comes to me and they say they want to leave, but they don't want to leave for until a couple months until school is out. So I'm going to ask them, I'm going to brainstorm with them. Okay, so what are you going to do for the next 3 months while you're in the house? How can we look at ways to be safe? I will say, okay, in 3 months when you leave, for example, have you ever left before? Where did you go? So we want to find out where they're going to go in 3 months. I want to find out from them, how are they going to get there? Do they have the transportation? If they don't, do we need to advocate for them for a bus ticket or transportation? And then I'm going to say, do you have the legal right to take the children? You know, so we want to advocate for them as far as that piece goes. And then I want to say, what about money? Do you have the finances? So I want to advocate to make sure that they have money. And then most important, I want to say, what are you going to do while you're in the house with this person for the next 3 months? Let's talk about it. What are some of the things that you can do? You know, they can, code words work very good. For example, if you were my friend, I would say, and you called me, I would say, you know, I don't have a recipe for pumpkin pie. So that could be the sign to not call me or to call 911 because something's going on, whatever we develop. Code words work very good for children. You know, no pumpkin, not tonight. That could be the sign for the child to go in the other room or call grandma or whatever you develop. Victims of domestic violence don't generally just leave and say, sorry, I'm out of here, have a nice life. They quite often escape, quite often in the middle of the night with nothing. So, you know, if you take one of those big freezer Ziploc bags and you put important documents in it, and you could roll it up and you could put it in a tampon box. Most men won't go in a tampon box. You can have that there. Because if you're trying to pick up the pieces of your life and you have to leave in a hurry and you have to go access resources like food stamps or medical or something like that, they want some ID on you. And if you had copies of all that information, that would be great. One of my favorite things that I love to tell women, put your extra set of car keys by your bed at night. That way, if anything happens, you can just pull the alarm and at least pull the siren on your car. You know, packing an extra bag of clothes or toys or medication, put it in a backpack and just put it somewhere where you can have access to it. Plan your safety route. Most importantly, trust your instincts. I worked with a woman who wanted to leave, and she wanted to get a bus ticket for her and her little child out of Sacramento to go back east. And she didn't have any money, and she always had to show receipts for money that she spent at the store. So she would buy extra cans of tuna, and she went back and exchanged them, and she saved enough money for her and her child to get a bus ticket. So just thinking like that. So if a client comes in, we're going to talk to them about a safety plan. That's just given to us. And then if we do the danger assessment with them, we're going to look at their safety plan again based on that, on the scoring and what they've reported on their danger assessment. And then if we send them down the hall to speak to an attorney to do a restraining order, we want to meet with them afterwards. So now we can say, okay, let's talk about your safety when this person gets served. What are you going to do? Because restraining orders don't save lives. Safety planning does. A restraining order is part of a safety plan, but the minute they get a restraining order, again, remember, leaving and taking that control is the most dangerous time. So getting a restraining order, she's starting to take control. So we want to make sure that they have a safety plan. And then plan for going to court on their restraining order. Go with them if we need to. Go pick them up at a safe place, bring them back. So it's always changing, and then we're going to follow up with them. We're doing a lot of following up right now. We created 5 steps to a shelter-in-place safety plan. And so because it's really hard when you're sheltering in place, sometimes when you are being abused at home, you have the opportunity to go to the store or take the kids to school, a little bit more opportunity to be out. But when you're being shelter in place, you might not have those opportunities. And even this virus is being used against a lot of victims, like, I'm going to go get exposed or expose you and the children to it. I hope the baby gets it. It's what we've been hearing, things like that. So again, we've just connected 5 steps onto safety planning. So a safety plan is always changing.
And what kind of conversations, and I know this depends certainly upon the age of the child, but what kinds of conversations do you encourage the victim to have with the children about what's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good, as far as the domestic violence goes, that's a really good question, because I know for myself, my kids were 7 and 8 at the time, and my kids are adults now and have their own families. I used to think I was such a good mom because I was protecting them from seeing the abuse. Like I'd send them to grandma's because I could sense when it was going to happen. At least I felt I had that kind of control, not always. Or if they were in the bedroom, I always felt like they were okay if they didn't see it. And boy, was I sure wrong, because kids know. And if mom is being called a name, or if mom's depressed, or if mom's got marks around her neck, the children are not getting the nurturing that they truly, truly need, because mom is doing everything she can do to survive. So, we just want to talk to them. And you probably know this, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey.
Yes.
Are you familiar?
Mm-hmm, I am.
It's 10 questions. So, we share that with the moms in hopes that we can use it as a tool to educate them to where their kids aren't scoring high on those ACEs. And we share the long-term outcomes that can happen for a child who's been exposed to domestic violence. So we do have safety planning for the parents for their children. We talk about that with them. And, we don't want to scare our children any more than they already are. Letting children, a lot of times, one of the things I do with moms or fathers, sometimes their children act out. That's the term they would use, act out, or their behaviors are frustrating for a parent. But I always tell them to look at that sort of as a badge of honor, because they're not going to act out like that in front of the abuser. So they're acting out like that in front of someone safe, and it just happens to be you, mom or dad. You're that safe person. So look at it, as frustrating it is for you, look at it as a badge that you get to have, and then that can help you with the tools. And these are some of the things that you can do. I like, with little kids, I like doing, or even with adults, doing sort of, if you will, art therapy. Just create a silhouette of sort of a gingerbread man, or let them draw a picture of their own self from head to toe and use primary colors on, oh, these are your feelings. Red is anger, black is fear, yellow is happy, and let them color their bodies. And that way you'll get a kind of a sense of where they're holding all of that in.
We are just
So
about out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to just ask you one last question, and it's kind of a tough one, but if there was one thing that you would like to remember, what would it be? Or what do you think would be the most helpful?
I think what's the most helpful is just letting people who are going through this, that they're not alone, and they are stronger than they realize. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage to get through this and to survive these relationships, and that reach out, talk to someone that they trust. When someone told me that I was strong and they had respect for me, it just changed my whole world, because I never felt that before, and it gave me the hope.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Joyce, for being willing to come talk to me and talk to all the people who are going to hear your story, and especially hear what amazing wisdom and advice you've gained, over the past 10 years or so. So I just want to thank you so much again. And I look forward to sharing this with so many other people who I think can benefit from it.
Well, thank you very much, and if there's anything I can ever do, you know how to get a hold of me.
I do, and I'm sure I will be. So thank you again, Joyce.